Jerry's got a good job of turning it down to the right essentials for this to become
Harry Greene is going to say something.
started with a little bit better
Actually, it's a seminar a week ago. Check with you. A seminar a week ago. It's a little bigger. I got home, I didn't have it.
The crazy thing is, I'm actually not sure.
I'm pretty much finished.
I have a feeling that he and I actually don't see
big majors that can actually make it is try to do something large. Because that was one of the requests. Music, smart job. Yes, you wanted to like us, not just down. So that cynical too is indeed the aspect
How long is it?
I've not. Well, what they said is, well, guys, it's been a while ago, but I feel that I never got to it. But it's because it actually makes sense, right? I didn't did something. And they did must not know because I was talking that's what
afraid to take up a chair. Where are you sitting?
I've got that one so I can get the lights.
Which chair is it? That I can sit
And meanwhile, you can put these on.
Oh, that's right. I'm not going to turn this one off.
Yeah. You never know what comment is going to duck to
This is pretty fun. Two-gun Pete or something. This is the one he said I could just put in my. Didn't have to be right by me. I'll put that in my pocket. Right? Thanks for the water, Miyoko. Better make sure my phone's off. Gulp. This is pretty intimidating.
I said they filled up the audience.
Yeah.
It's intimidating.
Hi
Don't
there.
you teach introductory bio of some hundreds?
What's that?
Don't you teach classes of hundreds of people? You're okay.
I'm still intimidated.
Well, just deep breaths.
That's right.
Yeah. I've been to events where people now start with meditation.
Is that right?
Yeah, even a cooking class. I'm not necessarily recommending it. It could be done.
I don't think I'm going to try it and tell you. How do you like that desert cottontail?
Yeah, it's in your book. I've seen that picture. Poor thing.
I thought about just labeling it Texas Longhorn and Desert Cottontail.
Inside a log, perhaps.
You see the cottontail?
I do, yeah.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Monday Night Seminar Series. My name is Miyoko Chu. I'm Senior Director of Communications at the lab. This event is being live streamed, so I'd also like to warmly welcome all of you who are watching from around the world. Thanks to Cornell's Alumni Affairs team for streaming this tonight. And whether you're here or afar, if you are a lab member or supporter, thank you very much for your support that makes our work possible to improve the understanding and conservation of birds and biodiversity. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to announce that the Cayuga Bird Club meets next Monday, November 11th, here at 7:30. And following the meeting, the speaker will be Elizabeth Derryberry from Tulane University. Her talk, Songbirds Rise Above the Din, will reveal insights from her study on the evolution of bird song in urban and rural areas. That talk will not be live streamed, but the November 18th talk will be. So you can join us in person or on live stream on November 18th with the lab's Charles Eldermeyer for Behind the Scenes with Bird Cams. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Harry Greene, professor in ecology and evolutionary biology at Cornell. I first met Harry 20 years ago when I arrived as a grad student at UC Berkeley's Museum of Vertebrate Zoology, where he was on faculty at the time. And I wasn't a typical biology student. I'd spent the year before that doing science journalism, but Harry still agreed to be one of my advisors. And throughout the years, he's been an inspiring mentor and friend, not only in the realm of biology, but in storytelling. And I think you'll see why in a few minutes. He reveals nature's narrative through science, and then he weaves us as humans into that story. So whether by listening to Harry in our auditorium tonight, or in the field or in the classroom, or by reading his books, we all get to be students of Harry. learning about nature's most fascinating mysteries and the quest to understand them through science, and about the psychological and evolutionary dynamics between humans and nature. So Harry graduated from Texas Wesleyan in 1968, served as an Army medic, and then earned an MA from the University of Texas at Arlington and PhD from University of Tennessee. He was a professor and curator in the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology at UC Berkeley for 2 decades before moving to Cornell in 1999. He's taught vertebrate natural history, herpetology, introductory biology, evolution and biodiversity, and field ecology, all the while studying predator evolution, ecology, and conservation. Harry's honors include the Berkeley Distinguished Teaching Award, E.O. Wilson Naturalist Award, Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and California Academy of Sciences, President of the American Society of Ichthyologists and Herpetologists, and Cornell's Stephen H. Weiss Presidential Fellowship. And his book, Snakes, The Evolution of Mystery in Nature, published in 1997, won a Penn Literary Award and made the New York Times annual 100 Most Notable Books list. And his new book, Tracks and Shadows, Field Biology as Art, has been out for about a month now and has already received rave reviews. When you read it, you'll see why I feel this book was a lifetime in the making. And one of my favorite quotes is from Publishers Weekly. Achingly beautiful, Greene succeeds in illuminating the world as a place of beauty, harmony, and danger, deeply interconnected and worthy of cherishing and preserving. So the Wild Birds Unlimited store here has copies of both books if you should be lucky enough to get one before they sell out. And Harry will be happy to stay and sign books after the talk. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Harry, who will speak to us tonight about natural history, aesthetics, and conservation.
Thank you very much. How's my sound? It's okay? Everybody can hear me okay? Well, thank you, Miyoko, for maybe the nicest introduction I've ever had in my life. Thank you all for coming. I'm extremely proud to be associated with the Laboratory of Ornithology. I've known about this place since I was an undergrad back in the 60s. I've actually known John Fitzpatrick since a run-in by a pond in Panama in 1975, and we've been friends from several different localities for both of us ever since then. So I feel privileged to be here talking to you tonight.
Harry has a signal from someone that they can't hear well.
Okay,
Let's just check the mic first to make sure it's on.
it's on.
Oh, I don't hear it. Yeah, looks like it's on.
Hello.
There you go. Try clipping it maybe.
Maybe if I clip it a little higher, does that help?
Is that better?
Better? But you'd like more?
No, that's good. I think it's good. We'll give you a sign if it's.
Okay. All right. So before I actually give you my talk, I thought I'd talk for just a very few minutes about my little book, which I call my eccentric meditation on natural history. And I'm going to just read you a very few passages from it. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about it. I thought of the title for this book in the early 1980s, and I quickly decided I wasn't old enough to write it. I had sort of a vague notion of what it might entail. I was sort of stewing about some things that had happened to me during my 20s. I had an unusual youth. I was such a nerdy teenager that I'd already published 4 or 5 papers by the time I got into college. At that point, I discovered that humans have a social life, and I flunked out of 3 universities in rapid succession in an attempt to financially support my newfound social life. I took a job living in a funeral home, and I drove an ambulance for 2.5 years. Had a lot of experience with violence and death in a big city, and then got drafted as an Army medic. So some other bad things happened. I was doing about these things in my early 30s as an assistant professor with Berkeley, thinking how to write about these non-herpetological things and not really knowing how to do it. So I thought of this title, Tracks and Shadows, Field Biology as Art, without really quite understanding what I was envisioning, but I did figure out pretty quickly that I wasn't old enough to write it. So instead, I went ahead and studied snakes. Eventually, I wrote a book about snakes, and then when I finished the book about snakes, I started writing this one. So this little book has 3 parts. The first one's called Descent with Modification, and it's a memoir both of my first 30 years and also of a man, Henry Fitch, who was essentially the father of snake natural history. And I worked for Henry when I was a 16 and 17-year-old, so that's sort of where I got my start. The second part is called Conversing with Serpents, and it's about the doing of natural history. And so I'm just going to read you 2 paragraphs, one from each of 2 chapters. There are chapters about snakes, but there's also a chapter about deserts called Hot, Dry Places, and a chapter about rainforests called Hot, Wet Places. So I'm just going to read you the introductory paragraph to these 2 chapters about places. The Mojave encompasses 25,000 square miles of Southern California and adjacent states, threatening to bake anyone who dares enter. By June, it's an oven, and in August, even after dark, a merciless furnace. Scramble up a boulder on a breezy April morning, though, say on a flank of the Granite Mountains, and you'll bask in sumptuous austerity. Snow-capped San Jacinto pierces azure sky 100 miles to the southwest, 10,000 feet above the Los Angeles basin's smoggy border. Joshua trees dominate nearby rocky slopes. Purple flowers carpet the flats. A friend's boots crunch with metronomic cadence from an arroyo below, and the buzzing of a pesky fly feels like starlight, crisp but vanishingly small. Everything is weathered. The air tastes clean. As afternoon shadows deepen, distant ranges turn flat lavender gray. Creatures that perish here dry quickly, minus the tariffs of scavengers, and drift off on the wind. So that's deserts, hot, dry places. Hot, wet places. Rainforests are dimly lit and exceptionally diverse, claustrophobically dark and fecund, so no wonder tropical biologists end up puzzling over existential questions. At La Selva Biological Station in Costa Rica, giant trees with buttressed trunks tower overhead, obscuring the sky, and every glimpse holds the vibrant greens and somber browns of plants and their decaying remnants. After a torrential shower, the air reverberates with the buzzes, whines, and clicks of insects. Mantled howler monkeys sound off in the distance. All around us, leaf litter reeks from the chemical adventures of microbes, and over the course of hours, my puny primate nose wrinkles towards some collared peccaries, then heaps of rotting fruit and a pile of cat droppings. Rounding a trail curve, I'm baffled by a shimmering lavender stripe, dozens of yards long and a half-inch tall. Then I drop to my knees and contemplate thousands of leafcutter ants, each carrying a single delicate flower petal. And from time to time, slogging along the muddy paths, I imagine being overgrown by mosses and fungi, or devoured by spike-headed katydids the size of small mice. The third part is called Pretty in Sunlight, and it's my attempt to sort of make sense of the first 2 parts. So I'm just going to read you a couple of paragraphs from that. Earlier, I marshaled evidence that our dislike for snakes has roots in ancient predator-prey relationships. The advent of science surely didn't eliminate such prejudice. In 1758, Carl Linnaeus, the Swede who first assigned species names to larger categories called genera, famously maligned amphibians and reptiles in his Systema Naturae as, quote, foul and loathsome animals, distinguished by a heart with a single ventricle and a single auricle, doubtful lungs and double penis. Most are abhorrent because of cold body, pale color, cartilaginous skeleton, filthy skin, fierce aspect, calculating eye, offensive smell, harsh voice, squalid habitation, and terrible venom. And so their creator has not exerted his powers to make many of them, unquote. Well, thanks to 250-odd years of vertebrate biology, we now know that most of those claims are false, although it is true that male lizards and snakes have 2 sex organs. Well, by the late 20th century, we learned a lot more about serpents, so it's surprising to find a modern equivalent excuse me, of Linnaeus's ignorant sentiments coming from Alexander Skutch, widely acclaimed for studies of Costa Rican birds. Skutch despised predators, condemned snakes with special vengeance, and among raptors praised only the laughing falcon, or coral snake eater. In earlier writings, he grudgingly allowed for predators in wilderness, but preferred a, quote, principle of harmonious association, whereby, quote, every member is compatible with every other, and there is mutual exchange of benefits, unquote. To justify killing tiger, rat, snakes, and other non-venomous species, he labeled them, quote, never really social and, quote, devoid of parental solicitude. Then he really got steamed up. Quote, the serpent crams itself with animal life that is often warm and vibrant to prolong an existence in which we detect no joy and no emotion. It reveals the depth to which evolution can sink when it takes the downward path and strips animals to the irreducible minimum, able to perpetuate a naked life in its naked horrors. The contemplation of such an existence has a horrid fascination for the human mind and distresses a sensitive spirit, unquote. So much of my book is meant to be my anecdote to Dr. Scutch, Mr. Scutch. And that's what I want to talk about tonight is basically why would we care about something that so many people might dislike? So let me have a sip of water here. Sound still okay? Thank you. So here's where we're going tonight. First, I'm going to talk very briefly about what I mean by the word natural history and why I think it matters to address the topic I'm addressing tonight. Then I'm going to introduce you to a really interesting dichotomy made by an 18th century German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, between the word beauty and the word sublime. I'm going to add in Darwin's notion of descent with modification, and I'm going to combine Kant and Darwin's insights into what we'll call a biologically sublime aesthetics. My overall point is to impress you with the fact that science not only provides us with the tools for managing populations and other aspects of conservation biology that we, I think, normally recognize, but actually I think science provides us with the information that actually leads to greater appreciation, to greater valuation of nature. In other words, we might come to care more about nature, particularly certain organisms, and thereby be more willing to sacrifice for keeping them. I'm going to illustrate my point tonight with frogs. 6,346 species of jumping machines as of today have been described. I've left out the snake part tonight for reasons of time. And then I'm going to jump from a sort of consideration of particular organisms, the frogs, to 3 short personal vignettes that I think illustrate some of the value judgments we're going to have to make in the coming years in terms of what we save and what we let go of. And those will entail the words wilderness, wild, and natural. So, why does this all matter? Well, first of all, I want to say that by natural history in the context of tonight's talk, what I mean is the phenomenology of what organisms do in nature, okay? The facts, so to speak, as opposed to the testing of hypotheses, the broader theory that explains bigger patterns and so forth. I'm interested tonight in actually address the way that we use the actual facts of animal and plant and so forth biology to change how we value nature. And why would we care about this so much? Well, I'm pretty convinced that we're actually in much worse shape than we're really able or willing to admit publicly. I think we're losing biodiversity at a horrific rate right now. I think the writing's on the table that we're going to lose a lot more of it before we can get much done about it. And I'd like to illustrate this with the example of the Costa Rican golden toad. I think it's a particularly poignant and really worrisome example of what we're up against. Now you have to stop and understand what a toad is, and I'll show you a picture of a more conventional toad later in the talk. We have a toad here in Tompkins County, the American toad. The family Bufonidae, the toads, is a cosmopolitan family. It's not naturally found in Australia, but it's on all the other major non-polar continents. There are hundreds of species of Bufonids, and basically if you've seen a toad is a toad is a toad most places. It's a moderately large amphibian. It's got dry, warty skin. It usually has a golden iris, but the rest of it's pretty drab looking. So imagine you're the young Jay Savage in the early 1960s, an assistant professor at the University of Southern California, and you walk into the cloud forest at what will one day be the Monte Verde Cloud Forest Preserve, and you see all around you these mating toads, the male of which looks like a burning piece of charcoal, and the female is a variegated black, red, and gold. This was so unexpected that Jay seriously considered the possibility that his grad students had played a trick on him and painted the males. Now, from your laughter, I can tell some of you know that grad students actually do this, okay? They do things like this, but it turned out it wasn't a hoax. It was a spectacular, completely unanticipated new species of toad. He named it Bufo peregrinis, became known as the Costa Rican golden toad. The Monte Verde Cloud Forest Preserve was established in part to save this animal. So I believe the description came out in 1968. The astonishing thing is that by 1990, this animal is extinct in the wild. There are no more golden toads. What really surprises me, and what's really disturbing about this, is that these animals didn't go extinct as a result of habitat destruction in the usual sense. They didn't go extinct as a result of overcollection for the pet trade. They didn't go extinct as a result of exploitation for their skins to make cowboy boots or something like that. They didn't go extinct because a bunch of people hated them like they hate rattlesnakes. these toads went extinct in a nature preserve, okay? And nobody saw it coming. We don't even know for sure now exactly why the golden toad went extinct. It was likely some combination of climate change exacerbated by this killer fungus that's taking on amphibians globally. I think this is disturbing because we didn't see it coming, happened in a nature preserve, and also because, as you know, there are many physiological similarities among all vertebrates. And if something untoward could surprise us in terms of the golden toad, we might stop and think about the possibility something could surprise us in terms of humans as well. Well, what to do about this? I think many people agree that education's the key to this, that it's a matter of hopefully convincing society by and large that nature matters, that it matters enough that we're willing to sacrifice in terms of our own use of resources and so forth, that we'll do something about it. And the question I'm raising tonight is, well, how does that happen? You know, how does education matter? And especially, how does science play into that? This is a photograph from my last Natural History of the Vertebrates class that I taught at Berkeley. This class takes a field trip every weekend, and the groups of students are led by teaching assistants and the 3 professors in the course. And the man sort of to the right of center there, who looks very serious, was my last PhD student at Berkeley, Javier Rodriguez, who's now a professor at the University of Nevada, Reno. He was doing his PhD work on the feeding ecology of gopher snakes. And it's a little hard to see in the picture, but there's actually about a 15-inch yearling gopher snake dangling from Javier's right hand. This is a harmless snake. He has just gently palpated out of the stomach of this gopher snake its most recent meal, which was a California vole. And that's what's in his left hand, okay? Now, Javier's looking so intently because this is a new data point for his dissertation research. So he's thinking to himself, okay, I've got to write down that the rear end of the mouse came out first. That means it was swallowed head first. I'm going to get out my Pasola scales and weigh the mouse and weigh the snake. I'm going to write all this down in my field notes. I'm going to take it back and put it in my data sheet. What I think is really interesting is the woman to the left of center with the big grin on her face. Her name is Saren Kim. She's now a medical doctor. Her nose is about 18 inches from a recently vomited, half-digested mouse. And she could not be happier. Look at the grin on her face. Now, why is that? She's been taught to appreciate this moment. This is not a naive moment on her part. Before we go on that field trip, she knows about the natural history of the California field mouse. She knows about the natural history of gopher snakes. She knows how it is that a snake can use its extremely modified skull to ingest a food item that might weigh more than it does. She's having what I'll come to call a biologically sublime aesthetic moment, and I'll get to that in just a minute. So here's another way to pose this question. You know, when we try to justify conservation, we can talk about it in terms of human utilitarian benefits, carbon sequestration, finding new drugs to cure cancer, and so forth. But what I'm interested in is, might we care about it sort of for its own sake? Might we have an aesthetically positive response? And if that's the case, does an animal have to be beautiful for that to occur? Now, this snake in this photograph, I have to tell you, I think I've worked in about 30 countries. I've seen most of the big cats in the field. I've seen some of the most spectacular birds by most people's standards in the field. And this snake is one of the most beautiful animals I've ever seen in my life. Okay, it's called an urutu. It's about a yard-long venomous lancehead in Brazil. And when we came around the corner of this red dirt road in one of Brazil's central national parks, she was stretched out, crawling across the road. When we walked up to her, she snapped into a defensive posture. We got close, took pictures of her defensive behavior, and then allowed her to go on her way. I really do believe that in my entire memory, this is one of the most beautiful animals I've ever seen. This is what Charles Darwin said about a very close relative of this species. The expression on this snake's face was hideous and fierce. I never saw anything more ugly. Okay? So clearly people can have different perceptions of what's beautiful, what's not. And the issue I'm raising here is, well, does it have to be beautiful for us to have a positive aesthetic response to it? And I'm going to argue that it doesn't have to be, that in fact we can have a very powerful aesthetic response that's fueled by the knowledge we gain from natural history. So here's this distinction Kant made. And I want to tell you that I did take philosophy when I was flunking out of Southwestern University, but I didn't learn much from it. And when I first found this paper by Ross Keister that explicates this difference between beauty and sublime as as defined by Kant, I thought that maybe I should go read Kant. And so I tried, and I got about 3 sentences into it. Right? And I'm talking about an English translation, not Kant in the German. So I'm not trying to portray myself as a philosopher. I just think that this is a very useful distinction, and I'll try to convince you of that. So Kant said, the beautiful concerns the form of the object being bounded. That is, something is beautiful or not just as it is. We could vote on it even. We could talk about somebody's sweater, we could talk about a statue, we could talk about this little book here, whatever. But there's no context for our assessment. It simply is or is not beautiful. Whereas the sublime is formless and unbounded, strikes the imagination in powerful ways. In other words, it's inspired by context. It's inspired by information. And let me illustrate this distinction first by telling you just a couple sentences about each of my 3 most treasured material possessions. Okay? That's what you're looking at in this picture, and some of you are probably puzzling about that already. The wooden thing in the middle is a rolling pin that my grandpa, who was a subsistence farmer in East Texas in the early 20th century, carved out of a single block of white oak with his pocket knife, and it was the sole Christmas present for his teenage bride the year before my mother was born. And I've owned that roll. My grandpa was my favorite person on earth when I was a little kid, and I've owned this rolling pin for several decades, and I use it to make cobbler dough and strawberry shortcake and things like that. The blue book is called Bombers Across. It was written by a pilot of a B-24. And my father, who was a navigator in B-24s over Europe in World War II, sent that book home to his parents in Endicott, New York, so that they would know what he's going through. And after my father died in 1985, my mother gave me this book, and I found in the margins my dad's penciled annotations as a 24-year-old about what it was like to be that scared, to be flying over Europe in the dark in the belly of one of these giant flying boxcars, as they called them. So imagine learning these things about your dad after he's already gone. By then you're 40, you know. And then the third thing, the one you're maybe really puzzling about, that's a Model 94 Winchester. When I was a little boy in Texas, if you said you had a deer rifle, you didn't even have to say what it was. It was an old lever-action Winchester. And in 1990, my PhD students at Berkeley gave me that antique Winchester as a sabbatical present. You cannot imagine, or maybe you can, how un-PC in Berkeley, California, a Winchester rifle is. But I cherish this old rifle. I like to take it out and shoot it. I think it has a beautiful stock, and it reminds me of my childhood. So maybe with just a couple of sentences about each of these things, you can see how each of these objects has an aesthetic pull on me that goes beyond what you might imagine just from looking at them. And so that's what Keister proposed, and what I'm sort of going to elaborate on is that we can take context, we can take additional information, and we can use it to establish a biologically sublime aesthetic with which we have an enhanced appreciation for organisms and nature. We're also going to add in Darwin. Darwin was obviously interested in aesthetics, and he obviously had an aesthetic sensibility about the world around him. This is that famous quote from near the end of The Origin: "Grandeur in this view of life, that from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have evolved." Usually when we think about Darwin, or at least hear Darwin talked about in a sort of modern public context, I think natural selection is what jumps to mind. But we should always bear in mind that Darwin's other great insight, or at least the one he publicized it more than anyone else up to that time, is that life has a history, and that there's this history of life includes the diversification of forms over time. And this is all inherent in his phrase, descent with modification, a really brilliant choice of 3 words, I think. And you can take this to sort of equate with ancestry, pedigree, legacy, heritage, or in other words, sort of group pride. You know, you might think of pride in your heritage as an Irish person, but I'm advocating we try to imagine sort of pride for frogs in general. And I'll give you an example of that in just a minute. In any case, what these 2 great thinkers lead us to is the idea of sort of combining natural history and evolution to produce this biologically sublime aesthetics. Now I'm going to illustrate this just with frogs. So I'm going to give you about a 10-minute herpetology course here. In fact, we could spend lecture and lecture, hours and hours and hours teaching about frogs. Truly fantastic animals, but we're just going to take about 10 minutes here to look at frog diversity. The first thing we need to realize is that all frogs share a fundamental remodeling of the back half of their body. Compared to earlier amphibians, and our local salamanders would make a good example of that, So think of a tetrapod, a tetrapod vertebrate, something like a salamander with a tail and 4 limbs. When a salamander walks, there's a lot of side-to-side movement of the entire spinal column like this. In fact, a lot of the propulsive force to a salamander walking comes from what we call axial bending, the torquing of the axial skeleton back and forth like this. And the limbs serve as sort of holdfast for positioning the whole thing, and also some propulsive forces go through the limbs. And most importantly, as you can see, if you can see me here, this is asymmetrical. So it's this side, this side, this side, this side. What frogs did was rebuild their whole hind end into a system of 5 paired movable joints that essentially act like a giant catapult. So if you look at a frog, one thing that's kind of, I think you'd all agree that when you look at a frog, one thing you usually notice is a bump in the middle of the back. So everybody know what I'm talking about? Okay, the funny thing is that's not actually the middle of the back. That's the end of the back, okay? That's the last vertebrae of a frog's spine is at the front end of that bump. The back part of that bump are the ilia, the 2 parts of the pelvis that extend forward like 2 rods. So you know in us, the ilia are these sort of flat things that you can feel here. You think of them as the top part of your hips. If you look at a human skeleton, they're these broad, sort of wing-like things. In frogs, those are like 2 poles that stick forward. And on each side, that pole articulates with a little wing-like structure that comes off the last vertebrae. So those 2 poles are hinged with the spinal column so that they are like this, okay? And that is the first of the 5 joints. Then you have the pelvis with the femur, the upper leg. Then you have the femur with the lower leg. Then you have the lower leg with the ankle. And then you have the ankle with the toes. And what frogs did was to move most of the musculature in the back half of their body so that most of the power is associated with extending all those joints, okay? If a frog had to, how would we put this, do something with an exercise machine that involved contracting everything up, it couldn't do very much, okay? It doesn't have much muscle force in that direction. A frog is really built for extending everything, and basically when a frog's eye tells a frog brain, you gotta move fast, it fires, all those muscles go, and it becomes a projectile. Okay? And that's true of all frogs, and that's something frogs invented more than 150 million years ago. I want to say one more thing before I move on. It's on this slide. Remember I said that salamanders were moving asymmetrically like this? I'm going to mention in just a minute the most primitive living frogs, and it turns out they still swim like that. Now think about it. You know what a frog kick is when you swim? Is a frog kick symmetrical or asymmetrical? It's symmetrical, and that's how most frogs swim. That's why we call it the frog kick. But the most primitive frogs still kick asymmetrically. So if you throw this little thing I'm about to show you, the tailed frog, into a bucket of water, it starts swimming like this, okay? Because it retains that primitive mode of swimming. So that's fundamental frogginess. What have they done with it over the last 150, 175 million years? Well, they've diversified incredibly, leaving us, as of this morning, 6,346 described species of frogs. About 1.5 times as many frogs as there are mammals, and about 2/3 as many species of frogs as there are birds, I think. We know a lot about how these frogs are related. I don't want you to even try to read these names or certainly not to memorize them. I just want you to notice that the whole group of frogs is technically called the Anura, which means no tail. And they're divided into 2 lineages. One of them has this long name, Liopomatidae, which is just our 2 species of tailed frogs and 4 New Zealand relatives. All the rest of frogs, the so-called singing frogs, which would be 6,340 species, are in the other lineage. Just keep that thought for a minute. Well, here's a highly pruned family tree of frogs, okay? So obviously if I showed you the whole family tree of frogs, we would have, I don't know, more than 10,000 lines on it, so we're not going to do that. This is a highly pruned tree, and it shows you relationships among major groups of living frogs. And once again, I want you to notice that if you go near the bottom there, that thing Triatobatrachus is sort of a pre-frog. But if you go to the next node up, you see that on the one hand, you have the tailed frog and its New Zealand relatives, and then you have everybody else. Now, the tailed frogs are found in the Pacific Northwest of the United States and southwestern Canada. It's a very nondescript little brown frog. You can see it there in that upper left photograph. In fact, the only distinctive thing about it to a naive observer is that it has this little appendage sticking out of its rear end. The tailed frog breeds in really fast-moving streams. And so it actually has internal fertilization, unlike most frogs. It has this little appendage with which it can insert the sperm into the female, have fertilization, and not have all its sperm basically wash down the Columbia River system into the Pacific Ocean. Okay? The rest of it looks pretty mundane. Now, if you take my herpetology class, you'd know a lot more about the tailed frog, and you'd know it's not a mundane frog, that it represents this very early divergence, that it kicks asymmetrically, that it doesn't sing, blah, 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 blah. So I take my herpetology class up to the Mendocino Redwoods, Northern California, and I walk up to a group of my students that are standing in a small stream, and they've just caught a male tailed frog. They've got this little 2-inch brown frog in their hands, and they're looking at it, and as I walk up, one of them says, "Wow, isn't it cool how this frog's got this little tool on its back end so it can fertilize internally?" And then this woman says, "Yeah, just think about it. This frog hasn't shared its genes with any other species on Earth since the Jurassic." And then another student says, "Yeah, we're looking at the basal frog." Okay? That's a sublime aesthetic. That's a biologically sublime aesthetic moment. They wouldn't have had that appreciation for that frog unless they knew all these cool things about tailed frogs. Everything else comes after that. Okay? And there's an enormous diversification, an enormous variety of descents with modification with our 6,346 species of living frogs. After the origin of jumping machineness in frogs, we get tongue flipping, by which the tongue's basically attached to the front of the mouth and flips out and hits the bug and then draws it in. We get sound production, all kinds of complex acoustical signaling among frogs for species recognition, for male-male territoriality, and so forth. We get incredible reproductive diversification. Okay? Now, you wouldn't see this here in Tompkins County. All of our local frogs have what we call the typical amphibian breeding cycle, where they come to water, they fertilize externally, the eggs develop in water, they hatch into little tadpoles which are aquatic and which are herbivorous, and then finally those tadpoles metamorphose into tiny little frogs. That's the so-called primitive amphibian breeding cycle. When you go to the tropics, you see frogs laying eggs or giving birth out of every conceivable hole in their body, and some you've never thought of. Okay? There's actually an Australian frog that's extinct now that after mating, the female would ingest the eggs, and they would go to her stomach. All digestive function would shut down, and the stomach actually functioned as a uterus. And then she would give birth by essentially regurgitating her little froglets. Now, if that doesn't sound crazy enough, there is still on Earth something called Darwin's frog in Chile, in which after mating, the male ingests the eggs, the fertilized eggs, they go into his vocal pouch. And so I didn't bring a picture tonight, but I've got pictures of a pregnant male Darwin's frog. And it's this little male frog with these gigantic bags under his throat. And that's all the little developing froglets in his vocal pouch. And he eventually gives birth by just regurgitating out these fully formed little frogs. Incredible diversity. I've shown you here on the right an Andean marsupial frog from Ecuador. And you can see what happens with this is after the eggs are fertilized, they're pushed into a pouch on the female's back. They form a placenta-like relationship with the female's tissues. And then eventually she gives birth to fully formed little froglets, which you can see emerging there. So Kant also made some distinctions among different kinds of sublimity. And one of his distinctions was something he called mathematical sublimity, where the aesthetic response would be based on numbers, on sheer sort of different quantities. And I think we could easily extend this to biologically sublime aesthetics. The example I'm going to give you involves frogs again. And to sort of give you a context for appreciating this, think about California. So here we have a large chunk of North America, the state of California. It has a substantial latitudinal expanse, goes from Oregon to Baja California. It has enormous habitat variance. It goes from dry deserts to wet, temperate rainforests. It goes in elevation from the floor of Death Valley to the top of Mount Whitney. This is a very topographically, botanically large chunk of North America, and the entire frog fauna of California is about 15 species. I could take you to a pond in the Cerrados, the savannas of Brazil, in which we could find more than 15 species of frogs calling in a single night. And if we visited that pond over the course of the season, we could find up to 40 species. We could find nearly 3 times as many frogs and toads in a single pond, maybe the size of this room, in the Brazilian Cerrados, as occupied the entire state of California. And each of them would have a different call. and many of them would be doing different things reproductively. So for example, in this picture, in the upper left, you see a little tree frog calling. In the middle, you see some frogs of a tropical group that make a meringue-like nest. So as the eggs are laid, the male and female kick the eggs really violently, and it forms a frothy mass that then hardens into a protective layer of the developing eggs. In the lower right, you see a member of that same group in which the male makes a mud castle and then sits inside it and sings, calls. The female goes into the castle with him. Apparently they're very modest about their reproductive behavior. They go in there, they mate, they lay eggs, then they both leave and they seal the castle. The pond dries up, and the next time it rains hard, it softens the castle, and all the tadpoles that have been developing there escape into the newly formed pond to grow and develop there. The middle lower thing is of some things called leaf frogs. They lay eggs, but they lay eggs on foliage above the water body. So the eggs develop up in the air, and then when the eggs hatch, the tadpoles flip themselves down to the water. A lot of size variation here. The frog on the upper left is about 1 inch long. The toad on the lower left is about 12 inches long. Okay? Tremendous diversification. If we were standing there in that pond when just 15 species were calling, we would not be able to hear each other talk. I mean, even I think putting our mouths to each other's ears and shouting, we would have trouble communicating. And I think if we were in that pond and you knew what I've just told you, you would be having a mathematically, biologically sublime aesthetic experience. Well, I've coined my own term. I didn't want Kant to coin all the terms for this, this perspective, so I've coined the term magical sublimity to connote the joy of discovery as a biologist. And I'm going to show you 2 examples of that taken on 2 successive nights in the Pantanal region of southwestern Brazil. I was there with my wife, who studies tropical frogs, and some of her Brazilian collaborators. And one of the Brazilians is a woman named Cynthia Prado, who had done her PhD work on this little frog. It doesn't have an English or a Spanish common name. It's just called Leptodactylus pedicipinus. And the female's about 2 inches long, and she does something very unusual. She's one of these frogs that makes a meringue nest, but after the nest is laid, she doesn't leave. The male leaves, but she doesn't. She stays with the eggs till they hatch, and then she stays with the tadpoles for several weeks until they transform into little froglets. And Cynthia had studied this parental care behavior in Leptodactylus pedicipinus. She'd even seen the female move the school from time to time, but she could not figure out why the female might move the school. So we were out at night looking for caimans and snakes and frogs and stuff, and she said, "Oh, Harry, come over, here's a pedicipinus. You can take pictures for your lectures." And so I started photographing this little female pedicipinus with her school of about 700 tadpoles. And while we were standing there, Cynthia suddenly said, "Oh, uma cobra," which means in Portuguese a snake. I looked to my left, and there was this spotted water snake, Helicops leopardinus, and it was just glomming down tadpoles. So I got totally distracted, grabbed the snake, opened its mouth, started pulling tadpoles out, and was sort of, you know, as a snake after all, right? When we look back, the tadpole school had exploded. It now covered an area of greater than a square meter. The female's still in the center. Can you all make that out from back there? See the female just to the left of that vertical grass stem? The tadpoles have exploded outward. And what happens over the next 20 minutes is that she moves that school 12 yards down the shoreline away from the direction that the snake had come. She does this by swimming for maybe a foot or so, stopping, humping her back up in the air, and then kicking her legs in place, sending out these waves, acoustic waves in the water. So I think you can see the circular waves coming out from her. The school of tadpoles would get strung out. She would stop. She would kick. The tadpoles would catch up, then she'd move on. And with this sort of repeated stop, kick, go off again, tadpoles catch up. She moved them over the course of 20 minutes about 12 yards away from the source of danger. Isn't that cool? I thought it was extremely cool. Look what happened the next night. We went for a drive along something called the Transpantaneira, which is a dirt road over this flooded wetland. We were just ecotouristing. And we found 3 family groups of capybara, the largest living rodent. And in each case, the capybaras were sitting absolutely immobile and vertical next to a calling reproductive chorus of the somewhat larger frog, Leptodactylus chacensis, shown in the lower right there. This is a frog about the size of our local leopard frog. Each time there was a male capybara, a female capybara, and several young. They were sitting right next to the water. And each time there were 2 to 4 of these Leptodactylus chacensis around the capybara and even hopping on the capybara. And while I was taking these pictures through my telephoto lens, I saw that frog sitting on the capybara flip its tongue 3 times in 60 seconds. Okay? These are cleaner frogs. Cleaner frogs. This is like cattle egrets. For some reason, my ornithology friends always laugh about this. I'm not sure why they think you can have cleaner birds and cleaner shrimp, but not cleaner frogs. But I'm convinced these are cleaner frogs. Now, the amazing thing is this has never been seen before. There's a fairly large literature on the natural history of capybaras. It's a very widespread, in some sense, charismatic mammal in South America, and there have been a lot of field studies on them. There are observations of them being cleaned during the day by various birds, but no one has ever watched them at night and seen frogs cleaning them, so we don't know if this is widespread or not. But there's a doctoral dissertation right there. Figure out the cues, in other words, the processes within individual capybaras and within individual frogs that result in this mutualistic behavior, and you'll have a spectacular PhD dissertation. Okay, just to sort of tie up this frog example, here's our local frog fauna. These are the frogs and toad of Tompkins County. We actually have 7 species here, so it's sort of interesting that we have almost half as many frogs and toads as the entire state of California, just here in Tompkins County. You might notice that 5 of them look more like each other than the other 3. That's because those 5 are all what we call ranted frogs, or sort of typical water frogs. The 2 in the lower left are members of the tree frog family, and then there in the sort of center right, that's our local toad, the American toad. So you can see all these animals locally. I've taught you a little bit more about frogs tonight. I hope when you see a frog the next time, you won't just think, oh, that's a frog or a toad. I hope you'll give some thought to the fact that you're looking at more than 150 years, 150 million years of descent with modification from a common ancestor that basically invented this jumping mechanism in frogs. Now I want to close by telling you 3 personal vignettes. In the last case, I'm going to tell you what I actually think in terms of my own sort of values, but I'm really more interested in sort of illustrating how information could affect how we feel about things, how we value things, relate to them, and so forth. And I think each of these examples entails some issues that are going to be important during the oncoming decades in terms of dealing with the loss of biodiversity. So the first example involves going to Africa. And in my book, Tracks and Shadows, I say that I have thought of 3 gifts I could give every young naturalist. I won't tell you what 2 of them are right now, but one of them is, if I could, I would send every young naturalist to Africa on foot. So I want you to be out there with the megafauna, not in a safari van. We can talk about the details later, but it's actually not hard to do this as a tourist. You can be out on foot among the megafauna, and I wish I could give everybody the opportunity to do that. It's a transforming experience to realize what it's like to still have an intact megafauna. We had an intact megafauna here until about 10 to 12,000 years ago. And so the 3 trips I've made to Africa, and on each of them I've, to varying degrees, been able to be out on foot, have sort of impressed me with 3 things. The first one is, we have this notion, in the United States especially, but in North America perhaps a little more generally, that wilderness means a place without any human presence, or at least without any human impact. If you go to Africa, I think it'll hit you too, that this concept cannot apply to Africa. Okay? There have been humans on the continent of Africa all the way back to when we called ourselves Australopithecines. Now we can talk about too many people, we can talk about effects of technology and pollution and so forth, but to define wilderness as a place without humans or as a place where humans have no impact is simply vacuous in the context of Africa. You can't do it. And it actually is vacuous here unless you go back about 12 to 15 or maybe even 20,000 years ago. So I think that's the first thing, is to sort of rethink this notion of wilderness as not having people. The second thing, and I'll say this as politely as I possibly can, poop is pristine. Okay? When you walk among an intact megafauna, the amount of dung on the ground is astonishing. It really is. It's everywhere. It's so abundant that you can easily do class projects by identifying different species of dung and counting them along transects, okay? In fact, does anybody, you want to take a wild guess as to what that is based on, just on things you might know from North America? It's a zebra, that's right. It looks like horse dung, but it's a zebra. Okay, anyway, I hope I've made this point. In fact, it's even true of the water holes. So you might think, well, at least there wouldn't be any in the water, but there is. The African water holes are just littered with it. And again, I say, poop is pristine, okay? And we've sort of gotten used to a notion in North America that poop is bad and that when you see, some kind of dung, that's bad. But in fact, that's the norm, and we're really missing something. And then the third thing in Africa is always wary, sometimes really scared, okay? You can't be out on foot among the megafauna without being constantly conscious of where the megafauna might be. I found that after a fairly short time there, I usually knew which way the wind was blowing. Yeah. And I never got out of a van, especially with students, without looking around, where's the nearest thicket that could hide a lion, a buffalo, or an elephant? And even, where's the nearest tree or rock pile that I could climb if I had to? That's a way of being, a way of sort of existing in nature and appreciating nature that we've really lost. And I have the impression that many of us actually wouldn't be willing to put up with that we would not easily go back to a situation in which we had large dangerous animals present, even though we had that here only about 10 to 12,000 years ago. Okay, second little vignette, the word wild. I grew up in Texas, and the last 5 years or so, I've made a really big point to try to spend as much time there as possible. And thanks to a friend who owns a ranch and raises longhorns, I've spent a lot of time out among these animals. I want to tell you just a little bit about the history of cattle in the New World, because I think environmentalists tend to think of cattle uniformly as a scourge on the landscape. But in fact, cattle came here with Columbus about 1502, 1503. They came first to the Caribbean, and then a very short time later, Columbus's ships took them to Mexico and to Florida. So we have these Iberian cattle that are brought to the New World, and then very shortly thereafter, about 500 years ago, they colonized Mexico and they colonized southern Florida. They then experienced about 500 years of largely natural selection, not artificial selection. The result of which today is something called in the Southwest longhorns, and in Florida, cracker cattle. They now look quite different from each other, although they share a number of characteristics. So this ranch I spend a lot of time on is a working cattle ranch, but it has only longhorns. The longhorns are treated basically like wild animals. They get almost no particular care. Because they've not been selected to give birth to gigantic calves, David never has to pull a calf, which is quite normal, especially with the first calf for these improved European breeds that have been selected for giant calves. He's never lost a calf to a predator. Can you imagine why? Just take a look at that particular cow there is named Shonuff. Would you want to try to bother Shonuff's calf? The meat from longhorns is almost as lean as venison and bison. During the worst drought in Texas history, these cattle were eating prickly pear and drinking scuzzy water off the surface of a drying pond, walking their little spindly-legged 40-pound calves 2 miles a day to get water. They do very well there, and what's really interesting is that there are 65 species of amphibians and reptiles and about 35 species of native mammals also doing quite fine on this ranch. So here we have a working cattle ranch that exists in a context in which you can have a great deal of biodiversity. And my pipe dream is that someday there'll be billboards along I-35 in Austin that say, keep Texas wild, proud, and healthy, eat more longhorn. Okay? I think that I could take you to the double helix, that's what this ranch is called, teach you about longhorns, and have you actually walk away thinking that the place was wilder for the presence of these cattle. That the cattle actually were a positive aesthetic component of that place. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the California condor. I promised that I would end on a bird. I promised John Fitzpatrick I would end on a bird. So here's the deal with the condor. When I moved to California in 1978, the condor was down to less than 3 dozen individuals in the wild, all of them in Southern California. By the early 1980s, there were only about, I think, 23 or 24 left. There was an extremely bitter controversy about what to do with this species, and particularly what to do with those 23 individuals. Some very prominent people in the environmental movement, like David Brower, were adamantly opposed to doing anything to save the condor because they said, first of all, we don't know what's causing the decline and extinction. Second, a condor in a cage is not a real condor anymore. A condor with a radio transmitter on it is not a real condor anymore. A condor with a number on its wing is not a condor anymore. It's just some kind of shadow of a real condor once it's been taken into captivity for a while. The other view was, we've got to do something. This is an iconic bird, largest New World vulture, a spectacular remnant of the Pleistocene megafauna in North America. We've got to save it. And the Save the Condor side won. Within a very few years, about $40 million had been spent, and we are now still spending about $5 million a year to keep the condor out there. There are more than 200 individuals, I believe, in the wild now. They range from southern Oregon to Baja California. They're in Utah and Arizona. We know exactly why they're in trouble, and that's because of lead ammunition in the gut piles and carcasses and so forth that hunters leave. We know how to solve that problem. If we solve that problem, we could probably cut the cost by 80% a year, something like that. So that's the dilemma. Now, I never saw a condor in the wild when I lived in California, and I cannot actually remember exactly how I felt about the controversy. I remember being intrigued by it, but I don't remember having a strong opinion at the time. So fast forward to the summer before last. My brother and his wife took a river trip in the Grand Canyon. I'd hiked in and out of the Grand Canyon before with a heavy pack just a few years earlier. But this time we came down the river in a raft. Kelly and I only wanted to do the first 5 days, so we hiked out on Bright Angel Trail. We were in a group of 17 people. I was the oldest person in the group. The youngest was 12 years old, and I swear that kid ran up Bright Angel Trail. It's 4,200 feet of vertical gain, and it's about 9 miles. I was the last one out, okay? I was the old guy, and I was feeling cranky about this, okay? So now it's 5:30 in the afternoon. I'm on the next to the last switchback up Bright Angel. I'm only carrying a light pack, and yet it's taken me something like 9 hours to get out of there. And I paused for a drink of water. I'm not kidding you. I'm fantasizing about a platform burial. So you know what a platform burial is? That's when Native Americans would wrap you in some kind of robe tarp thing and then put you up on the sticks, you know. And I was thinking about how cool it would be to just be left out there in the Colorado Plateau and have one coyote take one femur to the east and another coyote take another femur to the west. And I came around the switchback, I paused for water, I looked overhead, there's this giant silver storm cloud. And wheeling right over my head against the storm cloud were 2 enormous black birds with white underwings and slotted primaries. And you know how if you see a golden eagle in the distance, so far away that you can't see any of the field marks, but you've seen enough red-tailed hawks, and you go, whoa, I don't think that's a hawk, I think that's a golden eagle. And then you look, and it is a golden eagle, but you knew it already before you put your binoculars up. I knew these were my first California condors, the first ones I'd ever seen in the field, and they were wheeling right over me. And the first thing I said was, I'm not ready for you yet. And the second thing I said was worth every penny. So thank you for your attention. I hope I've given you something to think about.
We have time for questions for Harry, but because it's hard for people on live stream to hear the audience, Harry, if you wouldn't mind repeating the question,
Okay.
that would help. Thanks.
All right. Mr. Red Hoodie.
I'm always curious when they start talking about species going extinct, because they never mention the other side of it, that how many are being discovered. How many frog species are being discovered versus how many are going extinct?
Yeah, so the question is, talking about frogs going extinct, how many new frog species are being discovered? That is actually sort of the irony of it all. When I started teaching herpetology at Berkeley in 1978, there were slightly over 3,000 described species of frogs, and today there are about twice that many. So in fact, we're discovering new species of frogs at a fairly rapid rate. Some of them, and I could give you actual examples of this. Some of them, by the time the species description comes out in a scientific journal, which usually takes a year or two, are extinct. So that has actually happened with both lizards and frogs. New species have been described that were extinct by the time the species description came out. So I can't tell you a number. I don't think anybody would know what the exact ratio of being discovered new to going extinct is, but they're being discovered at a regular rate, and they're definitely going extinct at a fairly substantial rate. That's the word on the street anyway. Yeah. Yes?
Along the same line, you said that that number was as of today. Was that because there was a new species found yesterday, or just in general?
Yeah, so the question was, I gave this number and said it was as of this morning. There's something called AmphibiaWeb, which is housed at UC Berkeley, and which keeps track of all descriptions of new species of amphibians on a weekly basis. So you can go to AmphibianWeb, and it will tell you exactly as of this date how many described caecilians, salamanders, and frogs there are, and it actually breaks them down by families. So that's how I knew the exact number. Yeah. Yes, Mr. Greene. Joe, right? Okay.
Thank you. You read stuff in the 1800s from naturalists, and it's pretty common for them to say that reptiles are awful animals and they hate them. And that feeling isn't as common now. What changed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So he asked, what's changed in the last 150 years, let's say. And I think for a long time there's been diversity of opinion. So for example, in my book, right after I give the quote from Linnaeus, I give a quote from Decay, who wrote the Zoology of New York in the early 19th century. And he specifically goes after Linnaeus and says, in fact, snakes are wonderful, and has this long thing about that. So I think there's been some positive all along. Ben Franklin actually wrote a wonderful essay in 1775 about the timber rattlesnake, in which he extolled her virtues. It was a little bit hyperbolic. He said she's got 13 segments on her rattle, and if they all stick together, they can defend against the British and all this stuff. So, you know, but clearly, and he was eccentric. You know, he liked turkeys as a national emblem and not. But I think education's been a big deal. I mean, right now, I know of a Walmart accountant in North Texas who gives local state park talks on appreciating rattlesnakes. This would have been inconceivable when I was a teenager in the 50s. I met a cowboy in a bar. This is how the book ends, actually, on a positive note, or it almost ends this way. I met a cowboy in a bar in West Texas a few years ago who we just started talking, and I was curious what he might know about local stuff. And so I started describing my favorite lizards, and turned out he recognized me. You know? So then I described indigo snakes, which are just make it in the Chihuahuan Desert. And I said, do you get any big black snakes out there? And he goes, oh yeah, we see a big black one 14 feet long, which is kind of preposterous, but this cowboy was so big I didn't argue with him. And so then I said, well, what'd you do when you saw this big indigo snake? Did you kill it? And he goes, hell no, why would we kill that big dude? He said, our boss won't even let him shoot them diamondback rattlesnakes anymore unless they're right around the house. That is amazing that a West Texas cowboy would not shoot a rattlesnake because his boss told him not to. So I do think there's progress, and that's part of why I haven't given up hope for other larger and or dangerous organisms. I think we do have examples of how we can coexist with dangerous animals. We're not used to it by and large in the eastern United States like we used to be, but we do have examples to go by, and so I'm not ready to give up on it yet. Yes?
What do you think about the rattlesnake roundups that still go on?
Oh, I think they're disgusting. The question was, what do I think about rattlesnake roundups? I think they're barbaric, and I'm not against actually harvesting wildlife to eat or even to make leather or something. If it's sustainable, if it's humane, blah, blah, you know, I could actually conceive of situations in which I might even agree with harvesting rattlesnakes for some reason. But that's not what's going on in Oklahoma and Texas. It's a spectacle. It's disgustingly inhumane. It's counter-educational. I mean, they're skinning live animals in front of children.
What could be done to stop that?
Until about 2 years ago, I sort of had given up because there's so much political power associated with small towns in Texas and Oklahoma. And I also was pretty sure that academics speaking out against it did absolutely no good. So even though I'm from Texas, if I say I'm a Cornell professor, I am instantly stereotyped as a pointy-headed, commie, liberal, pinko, you know. What's happened is there's a bunch of people in North Texas and Oklahoma who have started a grassroots rise up against rattlesnake roundups movement. And they are just going crazy. They surreptitiously videotape the roundups, and then turns out Oklahoma has an explicit law against animal cruelty, which rattlesnake roundups are quite obviously breaking, and the Oklahoma Department of Conservation wasn't doing anything. This group has started videotaping the roundups and posting the videos, so I think it's going to be another social media kind of thing so I think their days are limited. Yes?
You talked about this acoustics in the water.
Mm-hmm.
I was filming American toad, and it was singing from the halfway in the water.
Yeah.
And it was sending those acoustic signals. So what does that do?
So
Do you have any idea?
the short answer is I don't. But so she asked about toads singing in water and whether or not there was, in other words, whether the water is part of the communication system. I imagine it is, but I don't know something specific about that. I did once see a garter snake turn and move towards a tree frog in California that was singing in water, and I think that garter snake was perceiving that frog from sound waves passing through the water. But my hunch, and so frog call's not my specialty, actually Steve might know, but I think that a lot of this is not well studied yet, and we're going to find out the whole thing is a lot more complex than we realize.
Okay, I'll send you the video.
Okay. Yes, Nick?
How are amphibians like the golden toad affected negatively by climate change?
Yeah, so he asked, how's the golden toad affected by climate change? So the golden toad in particular lived in a cloud forest environment. And cloud forests are characteristic of a particular mid-elevation region in the New World tropics. And this particular cloud forest sat on top of a ridge. So there wasn't any farther up the mountain to go for the golden toad, as there is in some cases where you have climate change occurring. And basically what seems to have happened in Monteverde is basically with just very modest drying, it essentially squeezed the cloud forest off the top of that ridge into oblivion. And the evidence is both the loss of cloud forest species from that habitat, there have been several that are gone, including harlequin frogs, but also there are now species of lizards and maybe other reptiles and amphibians, but I know of some lizards that 20 years ago or 30 years ago were not in Monteverde, were only found at lower elevations, and now they are there. And so I think the case that climate change is involved is quite strong, whether it's the only thing or whether it might include this chytrid fungus. I'm not sure about that. Yeah. Yes, Dr. Fitzpatrick.
Harry, you're a fan of big, scary animals. Could you comment on what the future holds on the Burmese pythons and other big, scary animals that are now starting to work their way north from the Everglades? What do you see the southeastern U.S. like in the next 20 to 50 years? So Fitz says I'm a fan of big scary animals and then jumps to the introduced python in the Everglades, which I am not a fan of, by the way. So I am a fan of putting back some things we lost at the end of the Pleistocene, but we did not lose any big pythons at that time. So I'm again the Burmese python in the Everglades. The stuff that I've read I think the most recent thing that happens implies that snake is really not going to be able to get too much farther north, at least under existing climate regimes. But beyond that, I'm not sure what to predict. A lot of those pythons died during a cold snap a couple of years ago. They certainly seem to have wreaked havoc on the middle-sized mammal fauna of the Everglades in the meantime. So I'm against them. I wish they would. Your sense as a naturalist on those animals is they're going to probably stay contained?
Yeah, I doubt they're going to go extinct. I don't know anybody in Fish and Wildlife that thinks that thing can now be extinguished. So we probably have a python in our, but South Florida, you probably know that. I mean, we have like 15 or 20 species of introduced herps there at least, I think, maybe more. So, yes.
A question from the online live stream audience here. There's a woman from Canada who's watching. She studies leopard frogs.
Cool.
And her question is that the frog that was on the back of the capybara, does it sound also like a leopard frog or just look like a leopard frog?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say it didn't. I'm pretty bad at calls, as a matter of fact. And Fitz and I are the opposite in this regard. He can just sing things all the time. And I don't have a good ear or a good voice for imitating frog calls. But those Leptodactylus chacensis
only very superficially reminded me of leopard frogs, and they didn't sound like leopard frogs. And they're not in the same family as leopard frogs either. Yes?
I really enjoyed the point that you make about the experience of sublimity requiring a knowledge of context, and that distinction with beauty, which is just a more of a reflexive response to form. But I'm wondering if you believe that in order for more folks in our society to have more sublime experiences, and therefore presumably to care more and be willing to sacrifice more to preserve these creatures and their environments, is there anything sort of qualitatively that we're not doing that we need to do, or do we just need to do more of what we're already doing to help those people understand those contexts better?
Yeah, so do you think that that question was heard or not? Because this is a great question. Should I repeat?
Repeat a little, please.
Yeah, so what's your name?
Rick.
Hi, so Rick, hi Rick. Yeah, Rick made, referred back to this distinction between beauty and sublimity, and basically wanted to know how might we encourage that people gaining context to provide the sublime appreciation for nature. Is that a fair abstraction, quick abstract? And
is there anything missing from our formula?
Is there anything missing from our formula? And I think what's missing is something we've always been doing to some extent, but that we do less and less, and that's to get people out into nature. And this is actually, you know, I started writing this, I thought of this book several decades ago. I started writing it over 10 years ago. And as I finished the book, I finally sort of realized that the whole book was sort of grappling with this issue of what does it mean to be part of nature? What does it mean to be out in nature? And what is the difference perhaps between being a spectator and being a participant in nature? And I think what we've become more and more is as people, especially in the more developed countries, is spectators of nature at best. Maybe even just spectators of video screens. But even when we're out in nature, I think probably more often than would be useful in terms of engendering sublime appreciation, we're just spectators instead of participants. So I think what we need is activities, is getting out of nature in ways that actually involve active learning and sort of actively engaging in nature. So, for example, in that Natural History of the Vertebrates course, students had to take detailed field notes. I am absolutely convinced that taking the field notes took them out of themselves and more into the lives of the organisms than they would be if they just said, oh yeah, that's a junco, or oh yeah, that's an acorn woodpecker. So I'm pretty happy about anything that non-exploitatively, and I mean that in a really bad population way, gets people out in nature and engaged again, including fishing and hunting and photography, bird watching, mushroom gathering, all these things. Yes?
Just to comment on the notion that a sublime appreciation has to do with an appreciation of context. I can envision like two types of context, or two ways to experience context. One would be information-based. It's like all the knowledge you've obtained by reading through scientific discoveries or study of a particular animal. The other kind of context is if we just look at the picture and you've done it right there. We have this condor flying, and you could look at the condor and be totally focused on the condor, but you could also stop and say, what is the context that my senses allow me to experience? And then you begin looking at the horizon, and you look at the formation of the rocks, and you look at the colors, and you look at the tree, and you look at the condor, and you feel the motion, and you become sensually immersed in context. Very different from understanding the geology going on in the landscape. And something like Georgia O'Keeffe painting, did she study geology? She certainly was a student of context.
Right. I guess I'm not quite ready to accept that there's a complete distinction between those two things.
I don't think there is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I'm just pointing it out because someone may get the impression that context has to do with a knowledge or a story.
And so there's a sort of now famous quote from a Senegalese conservationist named Baba Dioum, who said, we'll conserve what we love and love what we understand and understand what we taught. And I sort of like that because it incorporates sort of where as an academic scientist I fit into all this. But I don't believe for a moment the only way to learn is by listening to somebody stand up and talk, or even by reading a book. So I agree with you.
Yeah, well, one example would be if you love somebody, like your wife or your husband or your daughter
Mm-hmm.
or your mother or father, you love them because you understand their biology.
No, I'm thinking about it because I think it is more complicated than that. I think you love them because in a Vietnamese restaurant in 1999, they Heimlicked you and saved your life, or because you walked Priya Canyon together 3 times, and because context, you know. So,
Experiential context.
yeah. Yep.
Let's take 2
I take your point, but
Harry, maybe 2 more.
okay. Yes, sir. Blue blazer, dark blazer.
It's very clear that you care deeply about teaching and your students respond in this wonderful way. You can see that from the slides and from hearing this lecture. And I'm curious whether you think it's really because of that education that people come to deeply care about the environment, or whether there's something to Edward O. Wilson's notion of biophilia, that there's something innate in us which education will then develop and further.
Mm-hmm. Boy. So the question was whether there might be something deeper in our psyche as humans, or maybe even in primates, that involves appreciation of our surroundings and so forth.
Obviously, this is a hypothesis
Yeah.
of Wilson's.
Exactly.
I don't know how you would prove it or disprove it, but
Yeah. So, and he's referring to Ed Wilson's idea of biophilia. And it's certainly appealing to me. It's interesting that it does include things that you could sort of characterize as negative and positive. So if you just take the snake thing, something that's fascinated me for a long time is that we don't just have negative attitudes towards snakes. We also deify them in certain contexts. We're very curious about them. And one thing I've argued is that this is because we have about an 80 million year history as primates of both killing and being killed by snakes. And so it causes this kind of bipolar snake relationship thing. So the whole biophilia thing is fascinating to me, and I have a sort of a gut positive reaction to the idea. I think actually adducing evidence to support is very difficult. There's a book coming out very soon by Gordon Oriens about sort of evolutionary aesthetics that's focused on this whole notion, and I'm very anxious to read that book. So, yes?
One last one from the live stream audience. Could you leave us with some ideas or suggestions of other colorful, beautiful herps out there that we could look up after the talk?
Colorful, beautiful herps. Boy, the world is full of them. The world is absolutely full of them. So, you know, I showed... What's that?
What are your favorites, maybe?
Well, probably my favorite snake in the world is called the black-tailed rattlesnake, and that's because I spent 15 years studying one population in Arizona. So actually my favorite individual snake in the world was a black-tailed rattlesnake named Super Female 21, who we watched for 12 years, and we had 569 encounters with her over a 12-year period. Wow. Very, very beautiful animal. Yeah. Well, thanks for your enthusiasm. Thanks for coming tonight.
Would like to ask Harry to sign a book or ask more questions.